What is Slavic music? The answer is a lot more complex than one may assume at first glance. Ever since 2015, when The Witcher 3 came out, due to the very strong Slavic character of the game and the emphasis on using a non-blockbuster, non-Hollywood orchestral kind of soundtrack that has inspirations from Slavic folk music, ever since 2015, people across the internet verse have now developed this idea of what constitutes Slavic music. The problem is, these definitions of Celtic music and Slavic music are often somewhat misleading. See, to even start a discussion with the premise of Slavic music is already misleading in the first place because there really is no such thing as a Slavic sound. There's no such thing as Slavic music in the way that people conceive of semantically when they use the term Slavic music. See, when people say that this has a Slavic sound or this is the Slavic musical style, semantically it gives people the impression that there is a coherent, singular set of musicological features that are intrinsically Slavic and intrinsically tied to the Slavic peoples, as if wherever you go, where there are Slavic peoples, you will have music that always coheres perfectly with that kind of sound and that kind of style. And that is simply not the case. Now, that is a point that I've made in multiple videos before, like this video, for example, in which I explained that there really is no such thing as Celtic music in the way that people conceive of. Now, again, what do I mean by this? In the sense that when people say Celtic music, they think of a certain kind of sound, the sound of this region of the world. If you were to go to Vercingétorix in antiquity, when he was fighting Julius Caesar, you shouldn't expect his music to have sounded anything like what we now today think of as Celtic music. If you reconstruct or attempt to reconstruct Gaulish music using the instruments that they had, it's going to sound nothing like Celtic music. The reason is because what people refer to as Celtic music is only, and I mean only, the music of the British Isles for the past 200 years. And I say British Isles because the English, who are a Germanic people, are just as much a part of that musical style. It's by no means exclusively Celtic as a musical style. For example, the jig, which is one of the most famous musical and dance forms of Irish music, is well understood to be of English origin, but the term Celtic was applied to it for some reason, and nowadays people have taken that label literally, and so they literally expect, well, Celts would have had that kind of music. This is a sound that comes from the Proto-Celtic origins and survives to this day in the different Celtic people. No, it's not at all the case. And so then people will ask, well, then what is the Celtic sound? If it's not that, what is the universal Celtic sound? And the answer is, there is no such thing as the universal Celtic sound, no more than there is a Germanic sound or a Romance musical sound. And the same applies to the Slavic peoples. Is there a singular Slavic sound that you find no matter where you go in the Slavic world? Absolutely not. When you talk to people who are unfamiliar with ethnomusicology, very often they'll make assumptions like, oh, Serbian music must be more similar to Russian music than to Turkish and Greek music. And you ask them to explain why, and they'll say, well, because they're both Slavic, so they both share the Slavic musical sound. But that's the thing, there's no such thing as the Slavic musical sound in this sense. There's not a one singular Slavic sound that all Slavic cultures share. If you compare and contrast the musical styles found across the Slavic world, you're dealing with a completely inconsistent set of completely distinct musical systems that are very, very different from one another. And the same thing applies to every other ethno-linguistic family out there. What ethnographic data shows us over and over and over again throughout the world is that consistent similarities in musical style do not correlate with common ethno-linguistic categories or common ethno-linguistic ancestry. Rather, they correlate only with geographical proximity. Whenever peoples spend a lot of time, centuries, living in the same periphery of the world, in the same region of the world, they will end up having similar music. This is a map that shows the distribution of Celtic peoples, Celtic-speaking peoples in antiquity. In blue and in yellow, you have Germanic-speaking peoples. Now, very often people who are unfamiliar with ethnomusicology They assume that the Celts who live here, they assume that these people would have had a certain kind of music, and that the moment you go over there into the Germanic region, suddenly the music would have changed completely. So the scenario that a lot of people assume is that the Celts in this area would have had music that was fundamentally similar with the Celts living here and the Celts living here and the Celts living here. That's very often what people imagine, that musical similarities are defined by the ethno-linguistic group people belong to. But ethnomusicology every single time shows this not to be the case. The Celts living here and the Germanic peoples living here would have had a more or less indistinguishable musical tradition from one another. Very often, we overplay the importance of the ethno-linguistic group that people belong to. Very often, the region they live in is far more important. But please keep in mind, the examples that I was giving here were about music specifically. Because when it comes to language, for example, language actually works on the basis of this scenario that the moment you go to your Germanic neighbors, suddenly it's a paradigm shift. That's actually the case. Celts living side by side with Germans and having extensive contact with them, with Germanic people, and having extensive contacts with them, they would be unable to communicate with them unless they learn the actual Germanic language. But then those very same Celts in Central Europe, you teleport them to westernmost Ireland, and you have Celts there who have been separated from them by centuries, if not thousands of years, and developed completely distinct Celtic languages, and yet they would still have an easier time understanding those Celts and understanding the gist of what they're saying due to a higher degree of mutual intelligibility, whereas mutual intelligibility would be zero with their direct Germanic neighbors. The point that I'm making here is that not all aspects of ethnicity and culture are equally dependent on ethno-linguistic affiliation. Some aspects of an ethnos are far more dependent on the broad ethno-linguistic group that they belong to. Language would be an example. Genetics is to a degree defined by that. Mythological motifs are often defined by that. But then some other aspects of ethnic identity are far less dependent on ethno-linguistic affiliation. Music is one of those. It's actually quite amazing how little to no correlation there is. Architecture would be another example. There's no correlation between an ethno-linguistic group and architecture. Romance-speaking peoples don't have similar architecture because they all happen to be Romance-speaking. People in northeastern France have similar architecture to the Germans. The concept that I'm introducing here is that in the world, there are cultural zones. Cultural zones that have their own peculiarities in terms of some cultural aspects like music, like architecture, like clothing. Thracian music would be another example. Ethnomusicologically, there is a recognized style of Thracian music that's very much a tangible ethnomusicological category. But the thing is, Thrace is a pan-national and pan-ethnic region. It extends to Greece, it has parts of Bulgaria, and it has parts of Turkey in it. And the crazy thing is, Greek Thracians have more in common culturally in terms of dancing, in terms of music, with Bulgarian Thracians than they do with Greeks from other provinces. So the point is, in order to understand Slavic music, we first have to do away with the very concept of Slavic music, because ethnomusicologically, there is no such thing as Slavic music in the way that people imagine. Ethnomusicology does not deal in terms of Slavic music or Celtic music or Germanic music any more than it deals with concepts like Indo-European architecture. Like instinctively, everybody knows that that concept makes no sense. There is no correlation between Indo-Europeanness and architecture whatsoever. That's just not a concept that's applicable. Similarly, you have to understand concepts like Germanic music and Celtic music and Slavic music in this light. There is such a thing as Slavic music insofar as you can decide to arbitrarily put together a sum total of all of the musical styles that are found throughout the Slavic world. But this category that you formulated has been put together completely arbitrarily. The only thing putting this category together is the fact that the people playing these different forms of music happen to all be speaking Slavic languages. But a category such as all the music from the Slavic world is not a musicological category. You're not actually putting together music together on the basis of consistent, similar, fundamental features. If you decide to do that, You don't get Slavic music, you get Carpathian music, Thracian music, maybe Southern Eastern Mediterranean music, British Isles music, Fennoscandian music. What do you notice that all of these musical provinces, those musical zones, have in common? What they have in common is the fact that they are completely disconnected from any correlation with ethno-linguistic affiliation. In terms of Fennoscandian music, you're dealing with Indo-European groups and non-Indo-European groups. That's how ethnomusicology approaches things. Slavic, Celtic, Germanic, they are linguistic categories. They do not belong in ethnomusicology because they do not express themselves ethnomusicologically. So let us take a look at the diverse musical traditions of Europe that happen to correlate with geographical regions where Slavic languages are spoken. Notice how far more nuanced I was here instead of using the term Slavic music. What was Proto-Slavic music like? We don't know. Whatever that music was like, it seems not to have left a legacy in the form of a cognation between the multiple living Slavic traditions of today. There's no melodic phrases, there's no ornamentational styles, there's nothing musicologically speaking that we manage to equate solely with Slavicness when we look at all of the Slavic world. Except perhaps for one musical aspect. But we'll keep that for later on. So, the Slavs spread out and they split apart from their Proto-Slavic roots. They begin spreading out of their base, which we believe was somewhere in Eastern Europe, probably around Ukraine and Belarus. And many of them, for example, overtake the Balkans. When it comes to the musical traditions of the Balkan Slavs, especially Serbs, Bulgarians, that group, many people notice that their music has a very Eastern sounding flavor to them. They call it Arabic sounding or Ottoman sounding or Turkish sounding. And of course, the immediate assumption that everybody jumps to all the time is that, oh, well, it's the Turks. They Turkified Serbian and, Balkanic music because of the Ottoman Empire. And, if you've seen my videos before, you know that this is the most tired myth and misconception that I've debunked over and over again. The things that people think sounds Middle Eastern are often not actually Middle Eastern. They just happen to be associated with the Middle East nowadays. It's a case of association bias. People associate that kind of musical sound with the Middle East, and so they automatically correlated with, well, there were Turkish Middle Easterners there, and so that's how it came there. For the most part, the things that make Middle Eastern music sound Middle Eastern are elements that are rooted, to a large degree at least, in ancient Greek music theory. The music theory of the Islamic world was very much dependent on previous ancient Greek music theory. A lot of the scales and the modes and the notes, for example, that give off a Middle Eastern sounding vibe, they're actually of ancient Greek origin. And so a mistake that a lot of people, including Bulgarians and Serbs and Balkan Slavs themselves make, is that they'll hear stuff like this and they'll say, oh, this must be Turkish influence. No, this predates the Turks by thousands of years. This was found in the Balkans as far back as antiquity, in fact. So the recognizable sound of Balkan Slavic music with its Eastern twang is not the product of them being Turkified and Ottomanized later on. It's a product of them being influenced by the Eastern Roman Empire. For the most part, most of the aspects of that sound are to be correlated with the Eastern Romans or the Byzantine Empire, as some call them. Much of their music is of Eastern Roman influence. We see correlations, for example, in the fact that bagpipes are very widely used by Balkan Slavs, and we know that bagpipes originated somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East. Greeks had bagpipes back in antiquity, and the Eastern Romans, we have paintings showing bagpipes. So Balkan Slavic music has typological features that are very much rooted in ancient Greek music theory and the music theory of the Mediterranean basin of late antiquity. Of course, not all Balkan Slavs share those musicological typical traits, because even within the Balkans, you have Croatians, for example. The Croatians, their music, depending on the region, will not have those musicological traits. So the music of Dalmatia, for example, the music of the coasts tends to be very much of Italian specifically Venetian influence. If you go to inner Croatia and, like easternmost Croatia, usually their music will correlate pretty much with typical Balkanic traits. But if you go, for example, to the northeast, their music is almost indistinguishable from Hungarian music. Of course, another influence on Balkan Slavic music would be the liturgical traditions of the Eastern Roman Empire, what we nowadays call Byzantine chant. Byzantine chant is the style of Christian chanting of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's been very much picked up by many peoples of the Balkans. But what's interesting is that when you go northwards in the Middle Ages and you reach the Kievan Rus, the Eastern Slavs, those who will end up becoming the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Belarusians, those political units and those regions also adopt Eastern Orthodoxy from the Eastern Romans. They adopt the Cyrillic alphabet, of course, which is based on the Greek alphabet. However, the musical influence would have been much more lessened there, again, due to the factor of geographical distance. Whilst the Serbs and the Bulgarians were right in the periphery of the Eastern Roman Empire, in direct contact with them, this allowed their music to very much adopt those traits. But the Eastern Slavs, the Kievan Rus and everything, for the most part, their liturgical tradition that does not seem to have completely adopted the Byzantine system. They would have adopted melodies and chants, but not the entire music theory system. And nowadays, when you hear the orthodox forms of chant of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, they sound very different from Byzantine chant. Whilst Byzantine chant, again, has that modal quality that a lot of people automatically assume is Islamic influence or whatever. Ukrainian liturgical music, Belarusian, Eastern Slavic liturgical music tends to be far more Western leaning in nature. It is derived from later Western European developments. And in terms of secular music also, their music does not seem to have been very influenced by the secular traditions of the Eastern Romans, the way that the Serbs and the Bulgarians were, for example. So mostly they did not necessarily pick up the same instruments and everything. And this is something that I have to talk about because, very often I will have to deal with pan-nationalists from whatever ethnic group, be they Celtic, be they Slavic, be they Iranic, etc. And pan-nationalists really love the idea that all members of their shared ethno-linguistic group have the same kind of music fundamentally, that they have common features and everything. And so you talk to pan-Turkic nationalists and they'll look you in the eyes and they'll say, no, Turkish music is closer to Siberian Turkic music than it is to Greek music. Absolutely. Like they'll just look you in the eyes and say that. And so you have that with Celts also, and when it comes to Slavs, one of the arguments that one of the arguments that they use is the argument of, no, there are aspects that are universals among the Slavs. For example, in Eastern Slavic bardic traditions, their bardic poetical musical tradition was, the guslars. Those people were called the guslars and their instrument was called the gusli. And guess what? In Serbia, they also have people called guslars and they also use the gusli. This is a disingenuous argument because the gusli of the Eastern Slavs has literally nothing to do with the gusli of the Balkaners. And so this further goes to prove my point about how, when it comes to ethno-linguistic groups like Slavs, some cultural elements are very strongly tied to the ethno-linguistic groups and other elements less so. And music usually tends to be the element that is the least in conjunction, in cognation with ethno-linguistic groups. The only thing, there is a Slavic commonality there for sure. Their bardic poetical tradition is referred to as the guslar tradition, and they also both call their instruments the gusli, but the actual instruments sound nothing alike, and the actual music has nothing in common with one another. The guslars and the gusli of the Balkans are very much a product of the Balkans, whereas the gusli and the guslars of the Eastern Slavs of Ukraine, Russia, and everything are, completely distinct and a product of that region. And then finally, you have the Western populations of the Slavs, like the Poles and everything. And I want to spend a bit of time talking about the Poles, for example, because the Poles, being Catholic, are a great case study of the ways in which Slavic music differs extremely depending on which Slavs you're talking about and how there's not one coherent, singular Slavic style. Now, Polish music, its history, its recorded history at least, begins perhaps unsurprisingly with Catholicism. The earliest known pieces of music found in Poland are Catholic hymns like the Bogorodzica, or pieces of music that were written in a style that we find typologically very much related to the school of Notre Dame in the 1300s in Western Europe. So the earliest known pieces of Polish music, their typological features are defined not by any sort of connection to Slavicness or Slavic typological features. They are intrinsically related to Poland's integration within the wider Catholic world. Being a Catholic country, this ensures that the music of Poland always followed a systematic trend of being very similar to Western European music. Early modern Polish music is very much the polyphonic, harmonic tradition of the early modern age. And of course, Baroque music becomes imported into Poland with the arrival of the 17th century. At the height of Sarmatism and this sort of orientalization of their clothing and everything, you still have this emergence of Baroque music, this entire polyphonic tradition that is indistinguishable from the perspective of typological features from the music found in Western Europe. Baroque music, remember, is music that is Italian, French. It's really from that core part of Western Europe. It emerges from there and it is adopted by the Poles, perfected by them even to some degree. And then later on, you have the classical tradition. Of course, you have Chopin and all these great classical composers that come out of Poland. So the music of Poland was always primarily related to that of the broader Catholic world, the Western European world. When you compare it to neighboring Slavic countries, like Russia, for example, it always had Western European influences and features more systematically and far earlier than Russia did, for example. So Russia, after the reign of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and everything, really becomes a much more Western European-like country in clothing, in terms of fashion, in terms of many cultural elements. But Poland was almost always there, culturally speaking. And so if you were to ask me, well, what is the defining trait of Polish music? Is it the fact that it's Slavic? Not really, no. It's the fact that it's Catholic. Firstly, it's a Catholic country, and that comes with a whole lot of consequences.
The fez is not really a Slavic hat.
Indeed, it's not Slavic, but it was worn by the Slavs of the Balkans, hence its usage here. Many things in Slavic countries aren't Slavic, just as not everything in Germanic countries is Germanic.
Logic like this confounds me because suppose that I were to show a church in Bulgaria or in Serbia. Based on the same logic, that person should go, that's not Slavic. Christianity is not a Slavic religion, because yes, it's not a Slavic religion. It's a Semitic Middle Eastern religion. I see this same kind of hyperfixation on the ethno-linguistic group when it comes to cultures whose historical language used to be a Celtic language. Some girl in Glasgow has diarrhea, and people are going to be like, that's a Celtic diarrhea. The diarrhea is Celtic. It's Celtic. It's like, okay, look, not everything the Scots do is because of Celticness. Not everything the Scots have is due to Celtic. William Wallace, the great, a symbol of Celticness. You know what his name was? William. That's a Germanic name. Wilhelm. It's literally Wilhelm. By and large, Scots do not speak a Celtic language. For all intents and purposes, practically speaking, the Scots linguistically are Germanic. What's their religion? Christianity. That's Semitic. So the Scots are linguistically Germanic and religiously Semitic. And again, you can apply the same kind of deconstruction to every people out there. Poland is a Catholic nation. Catholicism is a profoundly defining feature of Poland, its history, its identity, its development as a nation. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that on many levels, Catholicism was a far more influential and potent force in Polish history than Slavicness ever was. Poles are defined by their Catholicism as much as they are by their Slavicness. The Irish are more than just Celtic. Iranians are more than just Indo-European. Every single culture out there is a complex amalgamation of many different factors. And very often we find people overplaying one of those factors only, in this case, their ethno-linguistic affiliation, like Celtic, Slavic, or Indo-European. And so they formulate assumptions on music that is tinted by this one-dimensional obsession with only one variable and attributes everything only to that variable. So the point is, what is Slavic music? Slavic music is the diverse, variegated European musical traditions that happen to overlap with regions where Slavic languages are spoken. That's really the only functional definition one may have for Slavic music, and the same can apply again to whatever other ethno-linguistic group you want to talk about. So what is Slavic music? It's this. It's this. It's also this. It's also this. So in the previous chapters of the video, we've established that it's very difficult to pinpoint any musical aspects that can be correlated specifically to an ethno-linguistic group and to derive a causality between the ethno-linguistic group and this musical style. For example, the idea that, oh, well, the way of, the fiddling style of the Irish is specifically due to them being Celtic. Therefore, it's the Celticness that informs that, and therefore it goes back to the Proto-Celtic era. No, like that's usually not the case in ethno-musicology. And you get some funny comments. For example, there's this song that I've worked on with the Skaldic Bard that he uploaded on YouTube, the separate version from the Varangian saga, and some guy comments on it and he says, this is inaccurate, this does not use, you can't really detect a Slavic progression of notes there. And you know that this person doesn't have any idea what they're talking about, because we literally used a Belarusian folk song as the melody. I did not modify the melody whatsoever. I literally just took the melody as it is, note for note, copy paste, and just asked Skaldic Bard to write Old East Slavic lyrics over it. So, people with those, we call it commentaires à l'emporte-pièce in French, they don't actually know what they're talking about. But the funniest thing is also just the concept of a Slavic progression of notes. What the fuck is a Slavic progression of notes? It means literally nothing. I mean, in Bulgarian and Serbian music use note progressions that go like this. You have the classic harmonic minor sound of the classic Russian songs and then you have those Belarusian songs that that start like this, like that, just that, that progression of notes. That's something that you find in French music, in Welsh music, in Irish. You find it everywhere across Europe. So what is a Slavic progression of notes? The range of note progressions that occur in the Slavic world literally range from what you find in the Middle East to literally what you find across the entirety of Europe. This idea of Slavic note progressions is equivalent to Indo-European architecture or Romance language clothing. It's the equivalent of going to Romanian nobles of Transylvania in the 19th century and looking at their clothing and saying, that's not Romance language clothing. There's no such thing to begin with as Romance language clothing. So the point is that in ethnomusicology, there are no musical concepts that permeate an entire ethno-linguistic group and whose causality is tied to that ethno-linguistic group specifically. Because in order for there to be such a thing, let's say in order for there to be a Slavic note progression, in the sense that this person means, in the sense that it is a note progression that is intrinsically Slavic and specifically correlated with the Slavic ethno-linguistic group, it would have to be a note progression that shows a unique correlation specifically with the Slavs and no other ethno-linguistic groups, and yet no such correlation is found. Not in ornamentation style, not in melodic styles, not in instrumentation, not in compositional norms, etc., etc., etc. By and large, there are, in ethnomusicology, no universal, all-permeating musical concepts that are specifically tied to ethno-linguistic groups. Not for the Germanic peoples, not for the Finno-Ugric peoples, not for the Iranic peoples, except perhaps for the Slavs. The Slavs may be the only ethno-linguistic group, at least in this area of the world, that actually have a common musical trait whose causality may be linked specifically to Slavicness. And that would be the white voice. The white voice is a technique of singing that employs a full-throated vocal posture used by women. And whilst there are small local variations from Bulgaria, Serbia to Poland, by and large, it's largely the same kind of approach to vocals, to the point that a Ukrainian singer, Yulia Vitreniuk, who uses the white voice for a Balkanic song, and, nobody batted an eye. It works perfectly. And the thing about this vocal style is that it shows specifically a correlation with Slavic peoples. Slavs in the Balkans use that kind of singing, but not the other Balkaners. Slavs in Central Europe use that kind of singing, but not other Central Europeans. This kind of singing very weirdly correlates specifically with where there are Slavs. Now, to be intellectually honest, we have to point out the fact that it's not only Slavs who sing like this. So Moldovan women also use that kind of singing, and Baltic women also use that kind of singing. But the thing is, again, it's so weirdly present in pretty much every single Slavic culture. I would be tempted to say that, yeah, it might just be Slavic influence on the Balts and the Moldovans, that they may have picked up a Slavic feature. But the thing is, again, it correlates way too strongly with Slavs to be rejected confidently as something that is not specifically Slavic, something whose causality is linked to Slavicness. It may very well be that the white voice is a way of singing that Proto-Slavic women utilized in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages. It's not a stretch at all to imply that. We're talking about the early Middle Ages, late antiquity. There are musical forms that are way older than this that are still continuous. Again, the Hejaz tetrachord, this thing that everybody thinks the Ottomans brought to the Balkans. This series of notes, Slavic note progression, is found in ancient Greek music theory. It was used 2,500 years ago in the Balkans, and it's still used today by the Balkaners. So, the white voice would be what, like 1,500 years old? It's really not a stretch that it would have survived after all this time in all the Slavic places. So, indeed, there may actually be a musical trait that is Slavic in the way that people mean, that is due to Slavicness and tied to Slavicness specifically, and that would be the white voice. It's not possible to prove with utter certainty, but it would be unreasonable to reject the possibility of it because the correlation with Slavs is far too strong. Now, disclaimer that prefaces this chapter. In this chapter, I'm going to be explaining how The Witcher 3's soundtrack is not to be taken as a literal ethnomusicological representation of any Slavic cultures in terms of music. In simpler terms, The Witcher 3 soundtrack is not authentic sounding to any Slavic cultures, and there are no cultures in human history that sound anything like The Witcher 3's soundtrack. However, I want to make it very clear that this is not a criticism of The Witcher 3 soundtrack. When I say that The Witcher 3 soundtrack is not actual authentic Slavic music, I'm not saying therefore it fails. No, The Witcher 3 soundtrack, as we're going to see in this chapter, is a soundtrack that vaguely incorporates elements of some Slavic-speaking cultures' music and mixes them with non-Slavic instruments and non-Slavic sounds and modern Western rock and metal conventions to create a fantasy kind of sound that actually doesn't exist in the real world. And that's exactly what it should be. The Witcher 3's setting is a Slavic-ish setting, and the soundtrack made for it is Slavic-ish. That's exactly what the soundtrack is supposed to be. It is a great soundtrack. It's one of my favorite soundtracks. I absolutely adore it. I've been listening to it since 2015 without stopping. However, a lot of people do confuse the Witcher 3 soundtrack for an actual representation of actual real music of the Slavic cultures. and I have to combat the misinformation here. I am not attacking the soundtrack, I'm attacking the generalized misconception that the Witcher 3 soundtrack is a representation of Slavic cultures in terms of music, whereas it's not. So what do we mean when we say that the Witcher 3 soundtrack is Slavic? What we mean by it is that it's a soundtrack that starts at its root with inspiration from aspects of traditional music found in different Slavic-speaking countries, and then filters them through the lens of the aesthetic and style of the band Percival. Percival is the band that Marcin Przebylowicz, the main composer and sort of music director of the Witcher 3 soundtrack, invited to perform much of the music for. Now, are they folk Slavic musicians? No, they're neo-folk Slavic musicians. They're neo-folk Slavic musicians who are part of that new medieval bardcore kind of aesthetic that I've talked about in length. So I've talked about this in my other videos before, but if you've not seen those other videos, then I have to do an explanation on historically themed music genres versus actual historical and ethnomusicological music. There's a distinction between the two, and very often misinformation rises from people not being able to distinguish which is which. So you have an actual historically informed or culturally or ethnomusicologically informed approach to music. For example, 6 months ago, I uploaded a rendition of Ivis Lolo, which is believed to be a song that stretches back to the Middle Ages, around the 1300s. And so I decided to make my instrumentation rooted in 1300 Southern French principles. So the way that the music is arranged, the techniques used, the harmonization technique used, the instruments used are all based on historical rationales. They're based on research. They're based on, looking at the documents and seeing what is the result that we can get. And one of the components that I used was the hurdy-gurdy, which is an instrument, but I also added in a rhythmic buzzing sound that goes z, 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 that the hurdy-gurdy produces. Little did I know, and little actually do many people that's actually a pretty weirdly common mistake in the medieval reconstruction scene that even historically informed people make, is that the components required to create that buzzing sound did not actually exist until the late 15th century. And because the song that I was doing was supposed to be contextualized before the 15th century, well, I had to correct that. I have a video that has 100,000 views, and I have to take it down. It's my professional and moral and ethical obligation, because my medieval reconstructions are meant to be informative reconstructions that are meant to give people an actual educational idea of medieval music. And so I had to take it down, and I removed the zzz sound, and I do that many times. People often remark that I re-upload older music because I'm always trying to correct it and everything. So that's an actual historically informed or culturally informed approach to music. And then you have other forms of renditions of Ivis Lolo, like this one, for example. This is what you would call new medieval or bardcore or whatever, because, for example, they're using an Irish bouzouki, which is an instrument from the 70s, and they're doing modern Western chord progressions, which did not exist at the time when Ivis Lolo was a song. The musical techniques used, the arrangement, and the instruments used are completely anachronistic. Or you have the Irish bouzouki again in this version, and then you also have the tagal harpa. The tagal harpa, which is an instrument that is Baltic and Finnish and everything. So why are they using an Irish bouzouki from the 70s and a Finnish tagal harpa and a Baltic tagal harpa because it's about vibes, vibes, whatever. So the whole new medieval bardcore kind of scene and everything doesn't care about actually being medieval, actually being historical, actually being culturally accurate. It's about choosing instruments that have a cool, mystical, historical vibe and whatever. It's in light fun. Basically, this whole pseudo-historical, pseudo-cultural, new medieval kind of thing that I'm describing is to music what LARPing is to real-life historical cultures. The point that I'm making is that the Witcher 3 soundtrack is rooted in that genre of music, in that approach to music. It's LARPing music, basically, based in the works of a band that approaches music with that kind of approach of vibes. So let's look at Percival again. Are Percival a folk band? No, they're neo-folk and new medieval, basically. So their main instrument, for example, is the saz, which is a Turkish instrument that is really at most 400 to 500 years old in the modern construction that they use. And so now you're asking yourself, well, why the fuck are they using a Turkish instrument? Vibes. And Some people would say, well, maybe they're using it because some Slavs use it, and indeed the Slavic peoples of the Balkans who were under Ottoman rule ended up adopting this instrument due to Turkish influence. And so you had, for many centuries in the Balkans, the saz was one of the main lute instruments. There was a vibrant saz tradition in Greece and Serbia and Bulgaria. Nowadays, it has mostly died out. It is somewhat more prevalent in Bosnia, so you will find it in Bosnian music. But again, you see the problem, like calling the saz a Slavic instrument would be a pretty big fucking stretch, because it's really not Slavic. It's just an instrument that I guess some Slavs happen to be playing it within the context of this instrument being played by Balkanic peoples due to Turkish influence. And yes, some of those Balkanic peoples happen to be Slavic speakers. So no, they're not playing some ancient Slavic instrument, they're playing a Turkish instrument. And I think that the reason why they play that instrument really has nothing to do with the Slavs or any of the aforementioned reasons. I think the reason they use this instrument is because of the rule of it feels and looks historical. Again, think of the Irish bouzouki. In the Bardcore New Medieval video, I talked about how the Irish bouzouki, a very modern Irish instrument that is less than 60 years old, has become the go-to medieval instrument that neo-medieval and new medieval bands use for their aesthetic. And increasingly, I'm seeing the saz being adopted for similar reasons. Increasingly, I'm seeing medieval themed bands and everything adopt the usage of the saz. I would actually not be surprised if very soon the saz ends up becoming the next Irish bouzouki, and everybody's going to think, oh, that's an ancient medieval instrument. It's not. It's a Turkish instrument, and it had no presence whatsoever in medieval European music. But so the point is, Percival uses a Turkish instrument, and then there's a lira that Byzantine lira was a Slavic instrument. This was Byzantine lira. It was the lira used by the inhabitants of the Eastern Roman Empire, especially in Constantinople and everything. I guess some Slavs may have ended up adopting it historically, but again, is it some ancient Slavic instrument? It's not. And then there's the bodhran that they use, which is Irish drums that are at most 100 years old. And none of this is bad, by the way. Percival is entitled to doing this. It's their sound, and they're going for a neo-folk kind of aesthetic. Again, I'm not criticizing them when I'm describing how their music is not authentically, anciently Slavic or anything. I'm just telling you to, if you enjoy their music, enjoy it for the correct reasons. It's neo-folk, modern reinterpretation of old Slavic traditional songs and everything. And then you have the fact that they implement folk songs from the Slavic speaking world in the Witcher 3 soundtrack, which is really great, and it really adds a lot of wonderful things. But really, outside of the tune and the lyrics that are being sung, not much about it is really sort of traditional in any sense. You look at the very popular song Steel for Humans, for example, which takes the tune and lyrics of one of the many variants of the Oi Lazare Bulgarian folk songs. If you think this is somehow traditionally Bulgarian, my God, you're mistaken. That's how it sounds in the Percival version. That's how it sounds in the Witcher 3 soundtrack. That's how it typically sounds in Bulgaria within its native ethnomusicological context. Almost fundamentally everything about the music has changed, from the instrumentation, the style of playing, the arrangement. Even the rhythm is not the same as the original. The original is in one of those funky Balkan 7 rhythms, and then the one you hear in Percival's version is a standard Western 4/4 kind of rhythm. So even when folk songs are implemented in the Witcher 3 soundtrack, they're not implemented in a straightforward traditional manner. Rather, they're implemented again through Percival's specific aesthetic lens. They're plucking elements from different Slavic speaking countries, different instruments from different time periods, and most of them aren't even really connected to the Slavs in any way. My ultimate point is that outside of the Slavic world, and especially within the community of sort of Western gamers and everything, there's this general impression that the music of the Witcher 3 soundtrack is a direct access to the folk sounds of the Slavic world, that you're hearing the traditional sounds of Slavic music, implemented in the soundtrack, and really the relationship between the actual traditional forms of Slavic folk music and the sound of The Witcher 3 is far less direct than a lot of those people actually realize. As somebody in this line of work, I'm well placed to tell you that the association or the expectation that the kind of sound of The Witcher 3 and those bands and those musicians, that this is now what real Slavic music is something extremely deeply rooted now, especially in sort of Reddit gamer Western communities. So, I work very closely with Slavic musicians to produce straight renditions of folk or historical music that are culturally or historically accurate. And there's always a few like Reddit gamers who are like, yeah, it's like that. You say Polish music, but that's not what Slavic music sounds like. I recommend you listen to the Witcher 3 soundtrack to get an actual idea of what Slavic music sounds like. I work with Yulia Vitraniuk, who's a Ukrainian singer. And there's always a few people saying, yeah, the singing's not authentic because it's not powerful enough. Slavic female singing is a lot more powerful. And the only reason they think that is because the Witcher 3 soundtrack, Percival's female vocalists, they start with a texture that's kind of like white voice, but then they really amplify it with those like really epic kind of screeches and powerful yells and everything. And again, for the most part, that's not what the vocals sound like in the Slavic world. Yes, you have that kind of white voice quality, but it's a lot more subdued and calm than those Witcher 3 trailer kind of sounds. But nowadays, if you have a Slavic song that doesn't have like the most epic, throat-piercing screeches, then it's going to be deemed not authentic enough by, Mountain Dew drinking gamers who think they know about Slavic music because they played Witcher 3. And my response to those people is always, oh, the vocals aren't authentic enough. Well, you're welcome to message Yulia Vitraniuk, an actual folk singer from Ukraine who literally gives classes on folk singing. You're welcome to go tell her that she's doing it wrong and she's not doing it authentically enough. Unfortunately, the life cycle of these things is that pop culture will implement elements of real life cultures and then amplify them in this commercial or epic or, kind of more popular manner. And then people mistake that for the real thing. And then they end up rejecting the actual authentic sounds as inauthentic because they don't match up with the pop cultural version of things. And of course, the rise of the Witcher 3 soundtrack, its explosion in popularity back in 2015, led to the dissemination of that, the popularization of that bardcore, neo-medieval, pseudo-historical, new age fusion kind of sound to really explode when it comes to Slavic music. I feel like a lot of people, especially outside of the Slavic world, their idea of Slavic traditional music is that kind of music that follows in the footsteps of the Witcher 3 soundtrack. So a lot of people listen to Alina Gingertail or Dryant de Lorraine thinking that, oh, I am listening to traditional music from the Slavic world. And I'm not making this video to try and get people to stop listening to these artists. God forbid, that is not my goal. Only for people to know what they're listening to, because there's a lot of people listening to that kind of music thinking that they're elevating themselves intellectually by, learning more about the anthropological reality of the music in the Slavic world. And, well, they're not. That's a completely different kind of thing. And I equate it to, playing God of War and thinking that you are delving into the anthropological complexities of Greek mythology as it was, or playing Skyrim and thinking that you're delving into Norwegian culture, or learning Sindarin, Tolkien's constructed language, one of the languages for the Elven peoples and believing that it's an actual historical European language. And the thing is, the moment I say that the music of Alina Gingertail and the Witcher 3 soundtrack and everything is not real actual Slavic music, I know that there's going to be a minority of fans of those people. If I just say Heilung is not real Norse traditional music or Scandinavian traditional music, people go like, why do you hate them? It's like, where does that mean that I hate them? I'm just delineating what it is and what it is not. And the reason I chose those examples, Skyrim, God of War, and Sindarin, is because I'm a big fan of those three. I adore Kratos' design in God of War, especially the first three games. I think it looks great. I love the Blades of Chaos. I love them. I'm a big fan of them. However, if I'm in a museum one day, a historical museum that displays historical artifacts for educational purposes, and they decide to put an image of Kratos with the Blades of Chaos saying, this is what historical Spartan soldiers look like, I'm going to be the first to speak out and be like, no, remove this at once. This is pure misinformation. This does not belong here. And most people can understand that that doesn't mean that I hate Kratos' design, but there's going to always be a minority of really dense morons who are going to be like, so why do you hate God of War? And the second moronic argument that those kind of defensive people get when they really want those forms of artistic expression to be the exact same thing as the real actual culture, they say stuff like, well, all cultures evolve. This is just the natural evolution of cultures. The music of The Witcher 3 and Alina Gingertail, that's just the natural evolution of Slavic folk music. Yeah, no, it's not. Claiming that these kinds of music are the natural evolution of Slavic folk music and are just in perfect continuity with all the rest and deserve to be regarded just as much as traditional Slavic music as that is fucking insane, because it's the equivalent of saying that the design of Ares in God of War, it's just a natural evolution of Greek culture. Ares was depicted differently across the centuries of ancient Greece. So why is that different? It's different because that's an American studio, with concept artists deciding to just churn out something completely different for reasons of artistic expression. Skyrim that's just the modern natural evolution of Norwegian culture. No, it's not. It's an American studio that decided to cherry pick cool parts and make up a fantasy world. You cannot treat Skyrim as just as much traditional to Norwegian culture as all the rest of Norwegian culture. Why create so many divisions? It's like saying that Sindarin, the everyday language of many of the elves in the Lord of the Rings mythology, is just the natural evolution of Welsh. No, it's not. Yes, it is heavily based on Welsh phonology and grammar and everything. At its core, Sindarin is kind of a pseudo-Welsh language. But yeah, you can't just take that language and go to the Welsh and tell them that's the natural evolution of your language any more than you can take the God of War design of Ares and go to the Greeks and say that's the natural evolution of your culture. We cannot just take the unique, specific twists that unique artists have on a certain culture and then take those twists that are completely removed from the native anthropological reality of said native culture and then go to that native culture and tell them that artist's vision, this is your identity now. This is the natural evolution of culture, and that defines you just as much what you call traditional to you. That's just completely idiotic and frankly kind of disturbing. Slavic music, to begin with, is the wrong framework to approach a deep dive into the musical traditions of the Slavic-speaking world, because it's equivalent to starting with an approach like Indo-European architecture. That's just the wrong way to approach things. For those of you interested in learning more about the musical traditions found across the Slavic world, don't type in the search Slavic music, because that's the go-to keyword that's going to lead you to all those cool vibes, neo-folk, neo-pagan kind of music, where you have Bulgarian religious festivity songs turned into epic badass battle music with Finnish instruments. So the best way to go about it is to type Slovakian folk music, Polish folk music, Bulgarian folk music. There are distinct individual regional forms of music in Europe that happen to be played by Slavic peoples, among others, and that's the way to approach it, not as one sort of united Slavic musical form. And now I know how a lot of people will be commenting, well, you've made an entire video on what Slavic music isn't and how not to interpret Slavic music, but don't you have actual videos detailing how Slavic music actually works? Well, again, as I've explained in this video, yeah, you're not gonna find videos of mine titled Slavic music theory. Let's analyze how Slavic music works, because again, there is no such thing in that sense. What you have is a bunch of variegated different local European traditions, and sometimes Slavs will happen to be some of the many peoples who adhere to those local European traditions. So, for example, I've made videos on medieval European harmony. Well, that's going to apply to some Slavs. And I've made videos on Renaissance polyphony. That's going to apply to some Slavs historically, or on Balkan music theory. That's going to apply to some Slavs. So just learn about Slavic music in this way, I guess. If you are interested in kinds of music that exist in the Slavic world, well, you're just interested in the kinds of music that exist in Europe historically and today. And so you can watch some of my epic talking videos about European music, and you're bound to learn a thing or two about Slavic music, in the sense that, well, Slavs are some of the peoples who play some of the many variegated styles of European music. Completely off topic from the rest of the epic talking. I just like want to talk to the Polish people right now, just like one-on-one. There's so many fucking kebabs in your country. Like, it's insane. Every 2 streets there's a king kebab, there's a kebab thing, there's a, like, żabka, I get it, like, it's, you need to, but I'm from the Middle East. I've never seen that many kebabs in the Middle East. I'm genuinely concerned for you guys. Are you guys okay? Because at first I was like, oh, it's funny, like this, but at this point it's not funny anymore. There's just too many kebabs. Listen, I know you Polish people. You have a history of, you know, Sarmatism. Oh, we are Iranians. Yes, we are just like the Turks. We're gonna start dressing up like them. And now I guess it's the kebab part. Listen, you guys are Europeans, okay? Just assumez-vous, comme on dit en bon québécois. C'est chill you don't need to be Eastern weeaboos. You have pierogi. Pierogi is amazing. Kebab, eating that much kebab is gonna fucking destroy your asses. Believe me, I'm from the Middle East. You do not want that level of diarrhea.